Kicks. That's what we're going to be talking about today. Really hard, slapping, punchy, powerful, transient, rich kicks that just slap in your mix. And we're going to talk about how to make them, what the difference is between sort of how beginners would do it, how people who would just rely on samples would do it, and why the method that we're going to show today works just a lot better if you want to have full control, if you want them to go as hard as possible, and why that's going to make your drums, so the kicks and the snares, as well as anything else basically that this methodology applies to, fit really well into the mix, find space between all of your other elements, and we're basically going to reveal how artists that really make the music that really slaps on the big festival speakers, but that also absolutely come through really well on Spotify, why they do it the way that I'm going to show you right now. And I know that you guys like to skip ahead to the, to the part where stuff actually happens. I would recommend you highly to listen to a little bit of explanation before you skip over to that, because this is really interesting. It's going to make a lot of things fall into place for you. So what we're going to be making today is a simple kick and snare pattern that sounds like this. Now, as you can hear, that's super powerful, and we're going to do three things. First of all, we're going to look at like how you would make kicks, sort of like making it in Serum or making it in any other synthesizer and doing it in one patch versus using samples, and why even when the samples are made by really great artists, that's also not always the best solution. And then how we can make layered kicks. That's the ones that you just heard. This video specifically is going to be about kicks, but stay tuned if you're also interested in the snare that you just heard, because there's going to be another video super soon on the channel that's going to go into that one. So please do hit that subscribe button and that like button, and I'll get that out to you as fast as possible. As always, if you want the preset for this, then you're more than welcome to download that for free in the link below. But so without further ado, we're going to talk about kicks, and what we're going to create here is, again, this. Or just the kick by itself is going to be this. Now, as you can hear, that kick really has a lot of sort of transient power in the beginning, but it also has a really strong sub, and it's as loud as it can possibly be. And so what I want to show you is why you shouldn't really do it any of the other ways and why you should do it this way. And for that, we're going to jump into two examples before we move into this specifically, just to show you what the difference is and why you would go through the extra effort. Because if you have been into drum bass production for a while, then you may have seen some of the master classes from like the real artists. Like, for example, there's one by Metric, like this one. And there's also like a long master class from Sofocus where I think he dives also into the kicks, and you always see that they consist out of multiple layers. And that seems like a lot of effort, but there are really legit reasons for that. So let's start with how like a typical beginner that has learned a little bit about synthesis would make a kick, right? And a snare. So I've got what we call the Serum group in this particular Ableton file. And I've got a kick that is synthesized with Serum and a snare that is synthesized with Serum, and nothing else has been done to them. This is basically, Drum Bass 101, how you learn how to make a kick. So let's open this patch. And if you've ever made a kick, you will kind of recognize what's going on here. There is a sub part, which is this sine wave, right? The level of which is controlled, so the amplitude. And then there's a couple of LFOs doing a few things. One of them is adding a noise layer, and in some other patches, sometimes there's another, noise or acoustic layer, whatever, that's sort of managed in the same way, that has a very sharp, transient here, or, that has a little bit more of a body there, that is layered on top of the sub. And then, as you can see, in literally every kick that's synthesized ever, there's some stuff done with the coarse pitch where, it's not just a sine wave that plays a low note, but it's a sine wave that starts out really high and then goes down the bottom. And that yields an okay result, something like that has all of these LFOs on the noise and on the level and on the coarse pitch, and then some effects like distortion and maybe a little bit of compression is going to sound something along the lines of this. And honestly, this is not bad. However, if you were to record this, right? So I've got a channel here that records everything from this group right here. I'm just going to put it on only the kick, and we're just going to go ahead and record this. It would sound something like this. So now here you can see the waveform of this kick, right? And as you can see, there's nothing really wrong with this, but there's a couple of things missing. First of all, it doesn't have that punch that we were talking about, because here in the beginning, where that punch is supposed to occur, you can see this is mostly the sine wave. You can see here from those little squiggly lines in the beginning that is the noise transient that we've added. If you have any other sort of like acoustic layers or noise layers or whatever, it'll also appear sort of like this. But there's a lot of headroom right here. There's some space left. and just generally speaking, it trails off very much into silence pretty quickly. And so that's why if you were to use a kick like this, unprocessed and with not any sort of like tricks done to it, this will not really punch through the mix. And the same would go for a snare, right? Which we're going to talk about in another video, but I'm just going to show you for context. If we have a snare that also, you know, has some standard effects on it, you know, nothing special, and that is the way that snares are, with like a transient that's a little bit higher than a kick, and again, a noise layer and all these kinds of things, you know, everything just in one patch. You're also going to get something, and this, by the way, this is really not a bad preset. This is one from Splice. It's going to sound a little bit something like this. Right? And you know, that also is fine, but as you could see before, I also recorded the snare here. The same thing is kind of happening here. You have a transient that is actually pretty okay. This is pretty loud, but you know, the rest of it has a lot of headroom, and there's not so much noise transient in the beginning. Whereas, you know, if you weren't aware of it, that noise transient, you know, so the stuff that's really loud at the beginning, that's what's going to make a drum element really sort of get the presence and the volume and the snappiness that's needed to punch through a mix. That's not really happening here. So if you were making, you know, maybe something like Liquid or anything else where all the elements are a little bit softer, this is probably okay. But the truth is, drum and bass these days is loud. And especially if you make like Dancefloor, or yeah, especially Jumpup, or anything in between, like the stuff that K9 and Dramatic are making now, like the really powerful stuff that needs to be big on festival speakers, this will simply not do. Another thing that people do, right, is they will use samples. And there are really good samples on, for example, Splice. I really like the ones that Shock One made, who is an incredible producer, but there's also a slight problem with those, because let's go here to a sample kick. I've got a couple here, but I've just selected a random one. You can see the waveform here. This is already a lot better. You can see here that this is a transient, this is super strong, but still there's some headroom here. And you can see here that the noise layer also reverberates throughout the sub, and the sub, you know, the sub doesn't get quiet as quickly as, for example, our little synthesized kick right here. But still, you know, if I were to record this, which I have actually done here, you can still see, even though, you know, this looks a lot fuller and looks like it's going to be louder in the beginning than this one, this is still not the best possible kick ever, because for the real presence of a kick, we want it to be as loud as possible, right? And so the reason that even samples by really great people aren't sufficing enough for that is because they made it that way for you. They want you to still be able to apply some things to it to make it fit in the mix. If this was already loud as possible, then it wouldn't fit for everybody. People would get kind of like in trouble with mixing, because you can't really undo a lot of like transient shaping and stuff like that, which we're gonna do in this video. So if you just toss a sample in there and you work with that, it's gonna be better, but it's still not going to be perfect. And what we want is we want really loud kicks, right? We want it to have a really powerful transient, a really powerful sub, and we basically want that to be just as present as possible. And for that, we need to create everything with the most possible control, and then we need to go and see how we can make that as loud as possible by actually looking at the waveform. So just for reference, right, what I was just making you listen to before, so what we're going to make in this video, first of all, you can hear that's much more powerful. But second of all, if we look at this waveform, check this out. This is super fat, super much present here. A lot of noise, very powerful, like really loud, almost square transient right here. And as you can see, the volume also, I mean, it trails off because it should. A kick shouldn't be, otherwise it's like an 808. But it's still, for the whole eighth note here, it's completely present. Hey, sorry to interrupt, but if you're watching this video, then my guess is that you're trying to become better at producing professional sounding drum and bass. And if you are taking that seriously, then you may want to hear about the School of Drum and Bass. The School of Drum and Bass is my passion project, and it's a membership that contains over 300 videos about music production in general, but also specifically about how to produce drum and bass. And there's just so much content in there. It doesn't matter whether you are a total beginner or if you've been producing for several years, because we go over everything. We cover very basic things like how to use Ableton, and all the way to, you know, what drum and bass actually is and how layering works and what the common drum patterns are and all those fundamentals. We have hours and hours of in-depth Serum tutorials aimed at making you a master of the synth and finally being able to translate the sounds that you hear in your head to something that sounds awesome in your synthesizer, so that you can create any drum and bass sound that you want. Plus also also the theory behind how that works. We also include professional mixing and mastering classes, for example, like sessions where we take an unmastered and an unmixed song and walk you through step by step how to make that sound professional, how to get that industry grade loudness and clarity. And one of the best things is we also have an entire section of complete drop breakdowns where we walk you through a recreation of a full drop of a popular song, and there's many of them in there where we go step by step, all the layers, making everything from scratch, how to recreate songs that you love. Also, very soon, we're even going to be adding complete start to finish song courses where we literally walk you from the very beginning to the very end into making a complete song step by step, taking you through how to make everything, make the drums, make all the layers, everything from scratch, and teaching you so many things you would have never found on YouTube. Actually add new videos every single week. Things like in-depth tutorials on super creative sound design, arrangement exercises, breaking down like the secrets of hot artists right now and what we can learn from them and what we can take away. Honestly, the School of Drum and Bass right now is probably the biggest, but definitely the most comprehensive drum and bass production learning resource out there on the internet today. And the best part is that right now we have a super special deal. The first 7 days you can join for just £1. So if that sounds like you and you may want to check that out, then go to the link in the description down here, or simply go to howtodrumandbass.com and make today the first day of your journey towards becoming a professional drum and bass producer. All right, now without further ado, let's move on with the rest of this video. So how do we do that? Well, let's really quickly look at what we were doing in the synthesis in Serum. And it doesn't matter if it's Serum, it could be any other synthesizer, right? But we're essentially doing a couple of things. First of all, we have this sine wave, which is going to be the sub. So that's going to be the v part of the kick. Then we have a couple of things that determine the transient. So essentially, if you don't really yet understand what the transient is, that is the part that's basically everything but the sub. So the higher frequencies that give the little click, you know, the little power at the beginning of the kick. And then of course, and those are made out of this noise layer that's controlled with an LFO. So we have some control over what noise, what sound to use, which is this selection here. We are controlling the level of that as well. And also because we have these in the matrix, these coarse pitch changes, right? So we have it to go pew. That's the part that is going to consist of the transient. That is those two things. And of course we are controlling also with an LFO the amplitude of the kick. Now, here's the problem. When we go into effects here, first of all, the effects for this in Serum 2, I'm not going to say they're limited, because if you really wanted to push it, you could do everything that we're going to do in Serum also. It's just, you know, a little bit more difficult. You'll have to do a lot of splitting like you see here, for example, but to a much higher degree. And essentially what we have here, and this is kind of the problem, is we have the transient and the sub in the same patch. And so actually what we want to do is we want to process those differently. A kick will always be 2 or maybe 3 or more layers, one of which is just a subby layer, and then the rest is the transient. And the transient itself might consist of, for example, a separate noise layer or a separate, you know, sample layer like a hi-hat or something like this. Those are the things that's going to give it that really rich transient. And so our aim, if we were to synthesize this completely in here, would be to make both of those as loud as possible without distorting, but they distort in different ways. Okay, enough about that. Let's show what we can do to make that ourselves. So if we go and we have a look at this layered group here, right? And don't worry, we're going to recreate this from scratch. But what you can see here is we have a kick transient that sounds like this. And that actually doesn't have any sub. You know, it has the part of the sub that goes from a very high octave to a very lower octave. So that's creating the sort of feeling, if you get me. And then we have the body, which actually only kicks in a little bit later, and together they sound like this. And they both have their individual processing. The transient actually in this case is very simple because we can do a lot of that in kick 2, which I'm going to talk about in a sec. And the body, we could also do separate things to that here. For simplicity's sake, I haven't done that, but we do have some processing on the group. And of course the effects in each of these are a little bit differently. So why does this matter? Well, because the transient probably needs to be louder and more distorted and more processed than the body. The body is going to be a sine wave, and a sine wave just needs to be loud, but for the rest, nothing really else has to happen to it. So we're going to create those separately, and for that, we're going to be using Kick 2. Now, Kick 2 is a paid plugin. I'm not affiliated with them in any sort of way, but to me, they've just made the whole process of everything that I just explained, which in Serum is a little bit vague. Like, if you know what you're doing, it's fine, but it's not very visually appealing. It doesn't really make a lot of visual sense. You just kind of do it because you know how to do it. Kick 2 makes that a lot easier. And I've just made a little group here with 2 channels, the transient and the body, like we just saw. And we're gonna use Kick 2 on here. Now, like I said, you can actually do what I'm about to do in other synthesizers. Kick 2 just makes it a lot more visual. And so I do believe that if you're a member of Sonic Academy, which is, I think it's like 10 bucks a month or something, I think there's even a free trial. You can get this with a discount, but even otherwise it's like 30 bucks. It's absolutely worth your money. And as you can see here, this is a lot more visual. And so what I was just talking about with the different things that we were trying to do when making a kick, those actually all have their own separate little windows here. So the first thing that we were talking about was we had a sine wave, right? So that's actually this part right here called sub control. And you can see here, it's literally just a sine wave. So that is exactly the same as that little part in Serum that we were just talking about. Then we have a click 1, 2, and 3. Those are layers. So noise layers or acoustic layers in which we can literally import anything. But also the cool thing about kick 2 is they have a lot of presets for that are going to sort of determine the rest of the timbre of your kick and that are also going to help with the transient. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to create the transient in one pitch of kick 2 and then the sub in the other pitch of kick 2, and then we're going to use an oscilloscope and we're going to use some looking at waveforms and stuff to make them fit perfectly together. So this might get a little bit complicated, but it's absolutely worth the effort, as you will see. Okay, so to create a transient, I'm just in the default thing right here now, but basically what we do actually want all of these layers. We still want this sine wave, so we're going to start with that. Just for reference, we have these little tabs here as well. This is the pitch of, I think it's of everything, but it's definitely of the sine wave. Then we have the amplitude, so that's the level of the sine wave. And then we have amplitude control over these samples here. Right now, there's, this is the default setting, so this actually sounds like something already. But this is not a very good kick. It's too boomy, etc., etc. So I'm actually just going to solo this sub right here. And we're going to be starting to work on the pitch of this sine wave first. Now, mind you, the boomy part, so the we don't need that in this particular layer. What we're going to do is we're going to actually increase this pitch here. So you can slide this up and down all the way to 20k hertz so that the top note at which it starts is D10. That's really, really high, but it's going to go down really fast. Down here, you can see the milliseconds, which you can move around. We're going to work with something around sort of the 500 milliseconds, something like this. But this is something that we can adjust later as well to make the layers fit together better. And what you can see basically, where it says 1.2 here, that's where our eighth note ends. So a kick is usually an eighth note, right? Now that we've put this on this like about 500 milliseconds, this part, the 1.2, that's where that ends. So all of this before that is the length of an eighth note. So we're starting very, very, very high. We're gonna go down pretty quickly to something around D7, which if that doesn't mean anything to you, that's 3 octaves down. So that's very, very quickly from very high to a little bit less high. If you've ever heard a kick, it may be hardstyle or something, it doesn't go boom, it goes doo, doo. That's kind of very, very little of what we're trying to do here. And as you can see, these points, right, they just go over time. So we can have massive control over how quickly, almost, pretty much the same actually as an LFO here in Serum that we had before, but we can actually see what notes we're playing at, which is very, very useful. We can't do that in Serum. So we're going to bring that down to about a C4, right around sort of a quarter of the eighth note. So this is all very fast. This is happening basically at 1/32th of a note. That sounds pretty nice, except it's quite long. Let's make sure that this trails off a little bit further. You can double click to create another point here. Let's put one at C3, sort of around 1/4 of an eighth note further. And let's add another point somewhere here. Might not be completely necessary, but let's go from like a G1. Yeah, something like this. And as you can see, within basically the entire eighth note, there's a very sharp drop in the pitch, and then it just kind of trails off. So you can hear that clickiness at the beginning that we've just created with the sine wave now. That's really strong. That's very present. However, it's very long. We don't need that because actually somewhere around this point, we're going to have our sub layer come in, which we're going to create in a separate patch. So we can head over into this amplitude and, well, this is still from the default setting where the amplitude goes up really, really quickly. We don't want to do that. We actually want it to already start all the way up because we need that loudness very much at the beginning. Then we're going to bring this one down to, let's say, like, maybe 2/3 of that volume because this is about where our kick sub is going to kick in. And then let's move these around a little bit. And around the 1.3 mark here, we're going to bring this back up to 1. And then it's going to go all the way down. And then all of these are basically going to go completely down. You're right. This line also, we can adjust this so that we literally just get a super sharp, very clicky transient. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start adding these clicks on there. So let's go into this window here, the click one. We're going to select something nice. So let's solo this real quick. Currently we have that. That's definitely an option. There are a lot of different presets. Some of them which sound a little bit more acoustic, some of them sound a little bit more clicky or noisy, whatever. What I really like is these live presets here, because they have a lot of, you know, acoustic, real live drum room layering to them. And since a kick is mostly just sub most of the time, and the transient is a part of a sine wave, we want something, you know, a little bit organic to add on top of that. That's why if you were to do this not within this program, you would likely layer like a hi-hat or an acoustic something or an impulse response from a convolution reverb on there. So let's pick this live 12. Let's pitch that up a little bit, and let's also high pass it a little bit. Then what we're also going to do is we're going to layer a hat on here. Once again, this is just a presetting kick too, but you could also, you know, in Serum or wherever or another separate channel, you could also layer a hat. Let me just solo this. Let's also high pass that a little bit. And then let's have a look at this part here, which controls the amplitude of click 2. And you can see that this is down all the way. So let's actually bring that up and maybe make sure that the amplitude, you know, if we click to make another point here, doesn't go past that 8th note, because we don't need it to go further than an 8th note. Now, some quick thing, actually, if you use this gate function in kick 2, it will actually only play for the duration of the note. So if you really want to make sure that your entire kick is nothing longer than an 8th note, which is smart because otherwise it will bleed into other layers, this being the 8th note, and you just want to make sure it doesn't bleed into here, then we can actually definitely make sure to do that with this gate option. So we're going to do that. And then if we put those layers together now, we have a very, very nice transient right there. What's really nice is we also have this option to drive it a little bit, which is essentially just a bit of distortion. But really for this transient, that's going to make it just sound more louder, more aggressive. It's almost a bit like clipping, because we actually have a limiter here. So it's just going to feed a bunch of overdriven sound that we've created just now into the limiter, make it a little bit more aggressive, which is nice. I think for now, we've created something that is relatively nice. The last thing that we could do is let's really quickly solo this sub layer again. We actually have some options here. So in Serum, you would, you know, pick a sine wave, or you would pick something else than a sine wave, maybe something with a little bit more harmonics or anything like that. We can do that here. We can actually go and, for example, in kicks, we can go to, you know, a different kind of kick. This is not actually a kick by itself. It'll just be a sine wave with more harmonics. But I really like what that sounds like. And you can scroll through a bunch of these. But for now, I think this is kind of what we're looking for. So this is our transient layer. Now let's start creating our body layer. That still sounds the same as the other preset, of course. But what I want to do here, let me just solo this sine wave right here. And we're going to do a similar thing to what we were doing before. Let's bring this pitch all the way up so that we start really high again. Because essentially, even though we won't really need this part, it needs to bleed into the transient part and this sub part needs to bleed into each other. So the sine part of it kind of needs to be the same, because they're gonna touch each other at some point. Bring this down again to something like G4, again to something like D2, somewhere there. And then, you know, at some point all the way down to D0. If you're wondering why D0 is sort of the lowest thing that you would possibly want, is because that means that, you know, around here, it's going to be at something along the lines of C2 or D2, and that is, you don't want it to hit on C, really. Like the lowest part, you could let it hit on C. That's only really for on big speakers, but usually you'd want something like, you know, something like D or whatever. And if we just let it trail down here, it's going to be somewhere around there at the very end of it, so that's good. It's already sounding better. You can make the length of this longer or shorter as well. Also very cool, but probably too long for drum bass. We're going to probably keep it around like somewhere close to 800 milliseconds. But for now, because we want to stop here, right, because this is where our 8th note ends, we're going to put on this gate so that it stays neatly within this note right here. However, we also have this amplitude here, right? And what we actually want is we want this amplitude to not come for a little while, because first we have that transient. So we kind of want that to only really start, you know, somewhere around here, about this area, because that's where our transient was just about coming down. So we're going to move a couple of these points here really quickly. We're going to do something like this, and then that's going to have some sustain. So this is basically the envelope, right? If you were doing it in Serum, or if you were controlling it with an LFO, it's the same as an LFO. And then this is going to trail down to something like this, and then it's going to stay all the way here. What we can also do is we can still add a noise layer. So I've just soloed the sub here, but I'm just gonna also add maybe another live thing that I found. For example, this one, let me just solo that. We're gonna do the same thing. This is the amplitude envelope, of course. And actually we're gonna bring this all the way down. And I just want that to come in somewhere around that 1.3 mark again, because this is the space that we've given for the transient. So just an extra little noise splash on top of the kick. So together now, you can hear that it's slightly delayed, right? And now if we mix this together, so if we have both of these, that sounds really, really, really strong. Okay, so what we're gonna do now is I wanna have a look at what we've created on the waveform spectrum so you understand why these fit together, right? So on the transient here, if I put the spectrum on here, which I'll make it a little bit bigger, we can see that the transient, because it is going from up, very quickly down, it peaks around 100, and everything below that is not super, super present. We could actually go on to, like high pass this. I don't think it's necessary for now. If we now put that on the body, we can see that our transient was hitting here. So that's really nicely after where our kick body is hitting. So these actually are already kind of, not ducking for each other, but they are not in each other's way, which is really nice. That's why together they already sound so strong. Now, we've skipped over one important part of doing this when you will be doing this by yourself, which is, of course, in this kick too, you have this little, this little length part, and you have the positions of all of these knobs, so how much the pitch and the amplitude trail off. I already sort of pre-mixed this, and I found that, this kind of amplitude envelope for the transient and this kind of pitch envelope for the transient works really well. And on the body of the subby part of the kick, because we basically use this 1.3 measure here, so like the half of the quarter note, so the 16th note, I guess, to do the same thing, right? We've kind of had these make space for each other, but when you're doing this, you want to determine how fast your transient is going to be. So on the transient, you might be moving around some of the amplitude or maybe even some of the pitch, and you're going to be doing the same on the body. Right now they fit really nicely together, but that's a little bit of messing around that you've kind of got to do to make them fit. So let's actually create a audio track here. We're going to call it record, and we're going to put the in on the kick group here so that it's going to catch both of these layers, right? Then we got to press this little thing right here, and we're just going to go press record. All right, now let's have a look at that. We've created something that is actually already really quite nice. We have this very, very strong initial transient here, right? Which is very, very noisy and very, very present. And we can see here that our body is also really, really strong. And it's not even, it's not even trailing off that much. So actually we've already done like a really, really good job. We could, however, go on further to add another couple of things. So one thing that I like to do for a little bit more of an extra acoustic layer is to add some convolution reverb. I like to use the Pro version from Ableton, but there are many other free and paid plugins for this. And pick something from Made for Drums, because there's a couple of really interesting things in here. And I like actually this drum gated one, this one right here, which obviously sounds way too exaggerated right now. But if we dial that in a lot, so first of all, we're gonna make sure that the lows don't get any reverberation. And then we dial back that decay. And of course the dry wet a lot. We just get a little bit, well, maybe we can put that decay up a bit more. We just get a little bit of an extra acoustic layer, which on the whole kick, which is essentially quite clean after that transient, it's just going to add a little bit more body, a little bit more presence, and a little bit more in the way of everything above the sub frequencies, which is quite nice. And now that we've got all of that, what I like to do is I like to put a transient shaper on here. In this case, we've already created something that is really loud, and so this is just like a finishing touch that you may or may not want to do. But if I put this up, it's essentially going to increase, as you can see here by this little curve, the volume of this starting part right here. And as you can see, just around here, like this is fine. This is great. But here we have quite a bit of headroom, right? We have quite a bit of headroom that we could still fill up and make even louder. So I'm just going to keep this one because this is something that, we've created before, and we can compare it in a second. I'm going to go back to this kick group. I've got this transient shaper on here, which is just going to make this little part a little bit louder. That is going to increase the volume in terms of decibels, but we don't really want that. So to preserve the headroom, so to not actually give us 5 extra decibels, but to give us more perceived loudness, we're going to feed that into a clipper. And you can see here, this whole red line means it's clipping a lot. However, even though this is probably now about 5 to 10 decibels softer, so actually real loudness is a lot lower, it still sounds almost the same level of loudness, and this is not clipping, so this is way better for mixing. Now this, of course, is absolutely beautiful because now we've created a kick. If I record this now, and I just take this kick right here, and put them next to each other, you can see here now that this part, which still left quite a lot to be desired in terms of loudness, has now been completely, well, I don't know if you want to call it compressed or clipped, but this is super, super loud. So this versus that. Now, I will say maybe this is actually even a little bit too distorted, but that's something that you can play around with on this group here. You can add as much transient shaping and clipping as you want. You could even compress it a little further. You could actually do the same thing to the transient and the body. So what's happening now is the body is getting clipped because we're doing this on the group, but we could actually also remove this, right? And just make sure that it affects only the transient here, which is probably the smarter move, because we don't really want, we want this body to stay a sine wave as much as possible, because that's just going to give the cleanest sound. And now, if we record this again, this looks really nice. And just like that, we've created a kick that is loud throughout the entire eighth note, that has a massive transient here. I mean, if we compare that to our other two things that we had, so the ones made in Serum, look at this, or even the ones with the samples, look at this, then our kick is so much more punchy. And this is like, you know, a rather complicated version of making kicks, but you can even go further. You can add more layers to your kick, like hi-hats, more acoustic layers, basically anything that's going to make it feel a lot more alive. You could go ahead and, you know, sort of like experiment with more different kinds of reverbs. For example, I chose now to get this convolution reverb, this specific one, but as you can see, there's a whole bunch of them, and there's so many options for this. But now we've got something loud, we've got something punchy that goes and cuts right through the mix. And if we pair that with a really great snare, have a listen to the difference. These are not exactly the same, because I obviously picked patches and samples that are slightly different. But if we listen to the drum loop from the samples, okay, not bad. If we listen to the one from Serum, I mean, also not bad. But then if we listen to what we made, that is just slapping. So yeah, if you want the preset for this, then you're more than welcome to download that for free in the link below. However, if you want the project file, which might be more convenient for you, with all the recordings and, you know, all the other stuff that we've done and the Rex and that kind of stuff, you can download that one in the School of Drum and Bass, which you have a link for below. All right, without further ado, I hope you enjoyed that video. Stick around for the next video, in which we're gonna make the snare, which also really slaps, which is, I think, actually, in some ways a little bit simpler, in some ways a little bit more complicated. Lots of cool stuff in there as well. Stay tuned for that. And with that, I'm just gonna thank you for making music with me today, and I'll hope to see you in the next one.